Sometimes the most unexpected prophecies come from the lips of men who've lost everything, only to find it all again in the arms of a woman they thought they could never trust with their heart. For Emma Carter, those words, "By summer you'll be carrying twins," seemed impossible as she stood shivering in the doorway of Thompson's blacksmith shop in Cedar Falls, Colorado territory, clutching her 3 children against the bitter February wind of 1882. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and Emma's meager savings had finally run dry. 8 months since consumption took her husband William, and she'd been moving from town to town, taking whatever work she could find as a midwife and healer. But winter work was scarce, and desperate people couldn't pay much for her herbal remedies. Now, with baby Jake burning with fever in her arms and her other 2 children hollow-eyed from hunger, she'd reached the end of her rope in this small mountain town. Through the falling snow, she heard the jingle of harness bells and the steady clip-clop of horses approaching. A magnificent black carriage pulled up in front of the general store, and out stepped a man who commanded attention simply by existing. Daniel Whitmore. She'd heard the name whispered in the boarding house where she'd spent her last 2 coins. Wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, they said. Lost his young wife in childbirth 5 years back and never remarried. Built an empire in cattle and silver mining, but lived like a hermit in his grand house up in the valley. Ben pressed closer to her side, his 8-year-old shoulders trying to shield little Rose from the wind while she clung to Emma's worn skirts. The boy had grown too serious these past months, taking on responsibilities no child should bear. Rose's once bright curls hung limp beneath her thin shawl, and baby Jake's labored breathing scared Emma more than she dared admit. She'd used the last of her feverfew and willow bark trying to bring down his temperature, but without proper shelter and nutrition, her healing skills could only do so much. That's when Daniel Whitmore looked directly at her through the swirling snow, his steel-gray eyes taking in their desperate situation with uncomfortable accuracy. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that probably cost more than most families saw in a year, but it was his face that caught her attention. Weathered by mountain winds and marked by grief, but not unkind. There was intelligence there, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind as he approached. "That baby needs to be indoors." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't judgment. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with the authority of a man accustomed to solving problems. Emma's throat tightened around words she wanted to say. What could she tell him? That she'd been a respectable woman once, married to a good man who'd worked the silver mines until lung sickness took him. That she'd tried everything, taking in washing, delivering babies, brewing medicines, but it was never enough to keep ahead of the bills. That 3 days ago she'd sold her wedding ring, the last precious thing she owned, just to buy milk for Jake. "I know who you are," Daniel continued, stepping closer. His boots made soft crunching sounds in the fresh snow, deliberate and unhurried. "You're William Carter's widow. He was a good man, worked hard in the mines. Heard you've been helping folks with birthing and healing." The mention of her husband's name nearly broke her composure. William had been everything good in the world, hard-working, gentle, full of dreams about the life they'd build together once he saved enough to buy his own claim. He'd never lived to see baby Jake take his first steps, never known that his wife would end up wandering from town to town like some kind of vagrant. "Mr. Whitmore," she managed, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm not looking for charity. We're just waiting for something that isn't coming," he finished quietly. His tone held no judgment, just the flat certainty of a man who'd seen enough of the world to understand how it worked. "Storm like this, it'll be days before the pass opens up again. That child won't last days in this cold." He was right, and they both knew it. Jake's breathing had grown more labored throughout the day, and without proper warmth and medicine, his condition would only worsen. The other children were showing signs of the same illness, and Emma's own strength was failing after weeks of giving them her portion of whatever food she could afford. Daniel moved closer still, and Emma could see the lines around his eyes, not just from squinting into mountain sun, but from something deeper. Loss, maybe. Pain that had settled in and made itself at home. The townspeople spoke of him in hushed tones, called him the richest man in the territory, but also the loneliest. His wife had died trying to give him an heir, they said, and he'd been like a ghost ever since, running his vast empire but keeping himself apart from anything that might remind him of what he'd lost. "My carriage is warm," he said, glancing toward the elegant vehicle waiting in the street. "And my house has rooms with fireplaces and a kitchen that knows how to fill empty bellies. Mrs. Murphy, my housekeeper, has grandchildren of her own. She'd know how to tend a sick baby." Emma's pride warred with desperation, and desperation was winning. But something in her still resisted. She'd heard stories about powerful men who helped women in need, stories that didn't always end well for the women. "Sir, we couldn't impose like that." "You're not imposing," Daniel said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "You're accepting help from a neighbor. That's what decent people do in situations like this." Ben looked up at her with those solemn eyes that had seen too much hardship for his young years. He didn't speak, hadn't said much since his father died, but she could read the plea in his expression. Rose had begun to sway on her feet, exhaustion finally overtaking the fear that had kept her upright. And Jake needed warmth and medicine and safety more than his mother needed her pride. "Why?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past her toward the mountains barely visible through the storm. When he spoke again, his voice was rough around the edges, unguarded in a way that suggested the words cost him something. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. And because my house has been too quiet for too long." The raw honesty in that admission made something shift inside Emma's chest. This wasn't pity, she realized. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was recognition, one wounded soul reaching out to another. She looked down at her children, at their thin faces and hollow eyes, and felt her resistance crumble. "Just until the storm passes," she whispered. "Just until the storm passes," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it either. The carriage ride through Cedar Falls Main Street felt like a dream wrapped in nightmare. Emma had never ridden in such luxury: padded seats, warm lap robes, even heated bricks for their feet. The children stared wide-eyed at the passing storefronts while she kept her gaze fixed on her hands, folded tight in her lap. She could feel eyes on them from every window and doorway as word spread faster than wildfire through the small town. Daniel Whitmore, the untouchable widower, had taken in the Carter woman and her children. Mrs. Henderson from the general store stood on her porch with her mouth hanging open. Banker Richard Stone stepped out of his establishment with a frown that could have soured milk. But Daniel paid them no mind, his attention focused on the road ahead as if he were simply running an ordinary errand instead of upending the social order of their mountain community. The Whitmore Valley Ranch sprawled across the mountainside like something from a fairy tale. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle stretched toward snow-capped peaks, bounded by split-rail fences that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. The house itself took Emma's breath away. 3 stories of honey-colored logs and local stone, with a wraparound porch and windows that gleamed like welcoming beacons in the storm. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, promising the warmth that Jake so desperately needed. Emma had glimpsed the ranch from a distance when William had done occasional work for some of the smaller spreads in the area. But seeing it up close made her acutely aware of the patches on her dress and the worn soles of her shoes. This was a different world entirely. One where people didn't have to choose between food and firewood, where children didn't go to bed hungry. "Mrs. Murphy," Daniel called as he helped them down from the carriage. A woman emerged from the house, middle-aged and sturdy, with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. She took one look at Emma and the children, and her expression immediately softened. "We have guests, they'll be staying in the blue room." If Mrs. Murphy was surprised by this announcement, she hid it well. Her experienced gaze took in Jake's flushed face and labored breathing, Rose's exhausted swaying, and Ben's protective stance beside his mother. "Of course, Mr. Daniel, I'll prepare some broth and get the fires built up. That little one needs tending right away." The inside of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. Polished wood floors covered with colorful rugs, furniture that looked both comfortable and expensive, and windows that let in floods of light even on this gray winter day. But it was the warmth that struck Emma most forcefully. Not just the heat from the massive stone fireplaces, but something deeper. Despite its grandeur, this place felt like a home. Daniel led them up a curved staircase to a room that was larger than the entire cabin Emma had shared with William. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, covered with quilts that looked handmade and well-loved. Two smaller beds had been placed near the windows, perfect for the children, and a cradle sat ready for Jake. Everything was clean and welcoming, as if it had been waiting for just such an emergency. Mrs. Murphy keeps these rooms ready, Daniel said, though he didn't explain why. There's a wash basin behind that screen, and she'll bring up hot water shortly. Supper's at 6, just follow the stairs down and listen for voices. The dining room's toward the back of the house. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Mrs. Carter, yes sir. It's Emma, isn't it? When she nodded he continued. Emma then, and I'm Daniel. We don't stand much on ceremony here. After he left, Emma sank into the chair beside the window and let the tears come. They weren't tears of sadness exactly, but something more complex, relief and gratitude and a bone-deep exhaustion that came from months of carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. For the first time since William's death, she allowed herself to truly rest, to let someone else shoulder the responsibility for her children's welfare. Mrs. Murphy appeared within minutes, carrying a basin of steaming water and an armload of clean linens. Behind her came a young ranch hand with more firewood than they could burn in a week. The housekeeper immediately went to work on Jake, her experienced hands gentle but efficient as she bathed him with cool cloths and prepared a mustard plaster for his chest. Poor little lamb, she murmured as she worked. Been fighting this for days, hasn't he? Don't you worry now, we'll have him breathing easier before bedtime. I've raised 6 of my own and helped birth half the babies in the valley. There's not much I haven't seen. While Mrs. Murphy tended Jake, Emma helped Rose out of her travel-stained dress and into a clean nightgown that someone had mysteriously provided. The little girl's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she managed a shy smile when she was tucked into the smaller bed with a rag doll that had appeared as if by magic. Ben proved more resistant to being fussed over, his serious 8-year-old dignity offended by the suggestion that he needed help. But even he couldn't resist the warmth of the room and the promise of a real meal. Emma watched him carefully explore their temporary quarters, touching furniture and examining books with the wonder of a child who'd almost forgotten what comfort looked like. Mama, Rose said sleepily from her nest of warm quilts. Are we going to stay here? Emma smoothed her daughter's hair, still damp from washing. Just until baby Jake feels better and the storm passes, sweetheart. Mr. Daniel is being very kind to let us rest here. But even as she spoke the words, Emma wondered if they were true. Something in Daniel's manner suggested this was more than temporary charity. The way he'd looked at her children, the careful preparation of the room, Mrs. Murphy's lack of surprise, it all pointed to a man who'd been thinking about this possibility for longer than the few minutes they'd stood talking in the snow. Supper proved to be a revelation. The dining room was warm and welcoming, with a long table that could have seated a dozen people but felt intimate with just the 5 of them gathered at one end. Mrs. Murphy had prepared a feast, thick beef stew with vegetables Emma hadn't tasted in months, fresh bread with real butter, milk so rich it left white mustaches on the children's faces. There was even apple pie, golden and fragrant, that made Rose clap her hands with delight. Daniel proved to be a surprising dinner companion. Emma had expected awkward politeness or condescending kindness, but instead found herself talking with a man who seemed genuinely interested in her children's welfare and her own experiences. He asked Ben about his schooling, listened to Rose's chatter about the dolls and toys that had mysteriously appeared in their room, and even managed to coax a smile from baby Jake by making silly faces during the meal. You mentioned you've been helping with birthing, Daniel said as Mrs. Murphy served the pie. Did you learn that from your mother? Emma nodded, grateful for the neutral topic. She was known throughout our county back in Missouri. Said I had the gift for it, steady hands and a calm heart. I've delivered more than 50 babies, and I know herbs for most common ailments. She paused, then added with quiet pride, never lost a mother or child. Something flickered in Daniel's eyes at her words, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But she filed the reaction away, sensing it was important even if she didn't understand why. That's a valuable skill in this territory, he said carefully. Not many trained midwives this far into the mountains. Hayes in town does his best, but he's getting on in years and can't always make it out to the more remote homesteads when women go into labor. The conversation continued pleasantly through the rest of the meal, touching on safe subjects like the weather, the growth of Cedar Falls, and the challenges of mountain ranching. But Emma was aware of undercurrents she couldn't quite read. The way Daniel's eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. The careful way he asked about her plans. The genuine warmth in his voice when he spoke to her children. After supper, as Mrs. Murphy bustled about clearing dishes and settling the children for the night, Emma found herself alone with Daniel in the main parlor. The room was masculine but comfortable, with leather furniture and shelves lined with books. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across the space. "I want to thank you again," Emma began, settling into the chair he indicated near the fire. "What you've done today, taking us in like this, it's more kindness than we had any right to expect." Daniel poured himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter and offered her one, which she politely declined. "You don't owe me thanks for basic human decency, Emma. Any man worth the name would have done the same. Would they?" Emma asked quietly. "Because in my experience, most people cross the street when they see trouble coming. They don't invite it into their homes." Daniel was silent for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried an odd note of vulnerability. "Maybe I needed the trouble more than the trouble needed me." The cryptic statement hung between them, and Emma sensed she was glimpsing something important about this complicated man who'd rescued them from the storm. Before she could respond, a thin wail from upstairs announced that baby Jake was awake and distressed. "I should go to him," Emma said, rising from her chair. "Mrs. Murphy's with him," Daniel said gently. "Listen." Emma paused, and sure enough, she could hear the older woman's voice drifting down from above, soft and soothing as she tended the sick child. The crying stopped almost immediately, replaced by what sounded like a lullaby in Mrs. Murphy's lilting Irish accent. "She raised 6 children and helped raise a dozen grandchildren," Daniel explained. "Jake couldn't be in better hands." Emma sank back into her chair, struck by the strangeness of having someone else care for her children. For 8 months, she'd been the only barrier between them and disaster. The responsibility had been crushing at times, but it had also been hers alone. This feeling of shared burden was both relief and something that felt dangerously close to trust. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, partly to fill the comfortable silence, and partly because she was genuinely curious about this man who'd turned their world upside down in the space of an afternoon. Daniel's face lit up as he began describing his operation. The careful breeding programs that had produced some of the finest cattle in the territory. The silver mine that supplemented the ranch income, the plans he had for expansion and improvement. His passion for the work was evident, and Emma found herself fascinated by the complexity of what he'd built. "It sounds like you've accomplished everything you set out to do," she observed. "Everything except the most important thing," Daniel said quietly, his expression growing distant. "I built all this to pass on to my children. Without that," he shrugged, a gesture that didn't quite hide the pain behind it. Emma felt her heart clench with sympathy. She'd lost a husband, but she still had her children, living proof that her marriage had mattered, that William's life had created something lasting. Daniel had lost not only his wife, but the future they'd planned together. No wonder his magnificent house felt like a monument to emptiness. "Children change everything," she said softly. "Before Ben was born, I thought I understood love. But holding your child for the first time, it's like discovering a completely new part of your heart." "So I've heard," Daniel replied, his voice carrying a note of longing that made Emma wish she could take back her thoughtless words. They sat in companionable silence after that, listening to the wind howl around the house and the comforting sounds of Mrs. Murphy moving about upstairs. The warmth of the fire and the first full meal she'd had in weeks were making Emma drowsy. But she was reluctant to end this peaceful interlude. For the first time in months, she felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally. There was something about Daniel's presence that made her believe everything might actually work out. "Emma," Daniel said eventually, his voice careful, "I hope you'll consider staying longer than just until the storm passes." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Mr. Daniel, I couldn't." "Hear me out," he interrupted gently. "You're a skilled midwife and healer. This valley needs someone with your abilities. Dr. Hayes can't cover all the territory anymore. And there are women out here who'd benefit from having someone nearby who understands their needs. The practical offer was tempting, but Emma sensed there was more to it than professional opportunity. "What are you proposing?" "A position," Daniel said carefully. "You'd have your own cottage on the ranch property, close enough to the main house for companionship, but private enough for independence. You'd tend to the medical needs of ranch families and homesteaders in the area. In return, you'd have security for yourself and your children, proper schooling for Ben and Rose, and the chance to use your skills to help people." It was a generous offer, more generous than anything Emma could have hoped for. But there was something in Daniel's manner that suggested he was holding back, not saying everything he was thinking. "And in return?" she asked. Daniel met her eyes directly. "In return, this house stops feeling like a tomb. My table has voices around it again. And maybe we both remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting." The honesty of his answer took Emma's breath away. This wasn't just about employment or even charity. This was about two people who'd been broken by loss finding the possibility of healing in each other's company. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I need time to think," she said, finally. "Of course," Daniel replied. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless." As Emma made her way upstairs to check on her children before retiring, her mind was spinning with possibilities she'd never dared imagine. The blue room was warm and peaceful, filled with the sound of healthy breathing from all three beds. Jake's fever had broken, his color already improved from Mrs. Murphy's ministrations. Rose was sleeping deeply, one arm wrapped around the mysterious rag doll. Ben lay awake, staring at the ceiling with the serious expression that had become his default since his father's death. "Mama," he whispered as she approached his bed. "Yes, sweetheart. Are we going to stay here?" "Really stay, I mean." Emma smoothed his dark hair, so like William's. "Would you like to stay?" Ben was quiet for a moment, considering. "Mr. Daniel seems nice. And Mrs. Murphy made me feel safe." "I haven't felt safe in a long time, Mama." The simple admission broke Emma's heart and made her decision easier. Whatever complications might arise from accepting Daniel's offer, her children deserved to feel safe. They deserved warm beds and full bellies, and the chance to be children again instead of tiny soldiers in a war against poverty and desperation. "We'll see, sweetheart," she said, kissing his forehead. "But yes, I think we might stay for a while." Ben smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in months, and closed his eyes with the peaceful expression of a child who no longer had to worry about tomorrow. Emma settled into the comfortable chair beside the window and looked out at the snow still falling steadily in the darkness. Somewhere in this house, Daniel was probably sitting by his fire, thinking about the future he'd just offered her. It wasn't the future either of them had planned, but perhaps it was exactly what they both needed. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the warm sanctuary of the Whitmore Ranch, a new chapter was beginning. One that would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But that held the promise of something neither had dared hope for since loss had visited their lives. The morning would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight they were simply shelter from the storm. Two wounded adults and three children who'd found unexpected refuge in each other's company. And in the distance, spring was already beginning its slow march toward the mountains, bringing with it possibilities that would transform all their lives in ways they could never have predicted. Part 2. The Healing Touch. The first rays of dawn filtered through the frost-covered windows of the blue room, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Emma woke to the sound of her children's peaceful breathing and the distant lowing of cattle in the pastures below. For a moment, she forgot where she was, confused by the softness of the mattress and the warmth that surrounded her like an embrace. Then memory flooded back, and with it came a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty that made her stomach flutter with nervous energy. Jake was sitting up in his cradle, his fever completely gone and his eyes bright with the curiosity of a healthy toddler. Rose had discovered a music box on the windowsill and was watching the tiny ballerina spin with rapt fascination. Ben stood at the window, fully dressed, and staring out at the ranch with an expression of wonder that reminded Emma powerfully of his father's face.
The first time he'd seen the Rocky Mountains. A soft knock interrupted her observations. Mrs. Murphy entered with a breakfast tray that would have fed them for days in their previous circumstances. Scrambled eggs still steaming from the pan, thick slices of bacon, fresh biscuits with honey and jam, and milk so rich it looked like cream. The sight of such abundance made Emma's throat tight with emotion. "Mr. Daniel thought you might prefer to break your fast up here this morning," the housekeeper said with a knowing smile. "Give you time to settle in without feeling rushed." The children look much improved, praise be. Indeed they did. Jake was babbling cheerfully and reaching for everything within his grasp, while Rose had already begun chattering about the wonderful dreams she'd had in the most comfortable bed in the whole world. Even Ben seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his young shoulders during the night. "Mrs. Murphy," Emma began hesitantly, "I want you to know how grateful we are. What you did for Jake last night, the way you've welcomed us into your home." "Our home," the older woman corrected gently. "And there's no need for thanks. Children belong in warm beds with full bellies. It's as simple as that." She bustled about the room, straightening already perfect linens, and adding fresh wood to the fire. "Mr. Daniels asked me to show you around the place when you're ready. Help you get your bearings." After Mrs. Murphy left them to their breakfast, Emma found herself studying her children with new eyes. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking. Rose's cheeks had regained their natural pink glow. Ben sat straighter at the small table by the window, and Jake's appetite had returned with a vengeance. This was how children were supposed to look, she realized. Healthy and secure, and confident that their next meal would be waiting when they needed it. The tour that followed Mrs. Murphy's promised introduction to the ranch proved to be a revelation. The Whitmore Valley Ranch was even more impressive in daylight than it had appeared through the storm. Rolling pastures stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle that looked fat and content, despite the harsh winter. The buildings were all well maintained and purposeful, from the massive barn that housed the breeding stock to the smaller structures that served various aspects of the operation. "Mr. Daniel built most of this himself," Mrs. Murphy explained, as they walked through the main barn. "Started with nothing but determination and a head for business. Course having the silver strike didn't hurt none, but plenty of men found silver and lost it just as quick. Takes wisdom to build something lasting." Emma could see that wisdom everywhere she looked. The ranch wasn't just prosperous, it was sustainable. Every decision had been made with an eye toward the future, from the careful breeding programs that ensured
Healthy livestock to the water management systems that would support growth for decades to come. This was the work of a man who thought in generations, not seasons. He mentioned that the area needs medical care, Emma said as they approached a cluster of smaller buildings that housed the ranch hands and their families. "How many people live on the property?" "Near 30, counting wives and children," Mrs. Murphy replied. "And there's homesteads scattered throughout the valley, another 50 or 60 souls all told. Nearest real doctor is Dr. Hayes in town, but he's getting on in years and can't always make the journey when folks need him most." They paused at a neat cottage with smoke curling from its chimney and the sound of children playing in the yard despite the cold. A young woman appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw Mrs. Murphy. She was clearly pregnant, probably 6 or 7 months along, and moved with the careful grace of someone carrying precious cargo. "Morning, Mrs. Murphy," the woman called. "Heard tell we've got visitors up at the main house." "Indeed we do," Mrs. Murphy replied warmly. "Emma, I'd like you to meet Sarah Beth Morrison, Tom's wife." "Sarah Beth, this is Emma Carter, the midwife Mr. Daniel's been hoping would come our way." The introduction sparked immediate interest in Sarah Beth's eyes. "A real midwife. Oh, bless the Lord. I've been so worried about this baby coming with spring still so far off. Dr. Hayes is a good man, but he's never birthed a child himself, if you know what I mean." Emma found herself drawn into conversation about Sarah Beth's pregnancy, automatically noting the woman's color, posture, and general health. Her trained eye caught the slight swelling in the young woman's hands and the way she favored her lower back when she thought no one was looking. Not alarming signs, but worth monitoring. "When are you due?" Emma asked. "End of April, near as we can figure," Sarah Beth replied. "This is our first, and I'll admit I'm more than a little nervous about the whole business. That's perfectly natural, Emma said gently. Every woman feels that way with her first child. But you look healthy and strong. I'd be happy to check on you from time to time, if you'd like. The relief on Sarah Beth's face was immediate and profound. Would you really? Oh, that would be such a comfort. I've been having the strangest dreams about this baby too. Can't shake the feeling that there's something special about this little one. As they continued their tour, Emma found herself naturally falling into the role Daniel had suggested. Mrs. Murphy introduced her to several other families, and word spread quickly that a skilled midwife was staying at the main house. By the time they returned for lunch, Emma had already been consulted about a colicky baby, a persistent cough that had been troubling one of the older ranch hands, and a request to look at an infected cut that wasn't healing properly. Seems like you're already settling into the job, Mrs. Murphy observed with satisfaction as they climbed the front steps of the main house. Emma realized it was true. For the first time since William's death, she'd felt useful in a way that went beyond simple survival. These people needed her skills, and she had something valuable to offer beyond just another mouth to feed. The feeling was intoxicating after months of feeling like a burden wherever she went. Lunch was a quieter affair than the previous evening's dinner. Daniel had been out since dawn checking on the livestock and ensuring the ranch was weathering the storm properly, leaving Emma and the children to explore their new environment without the underlying tension his presence seemed to create. Not uncomfortable tension. Exactly. But awareness. The kind that made Emma conscious of every word she spoke and every gesture she made. Ben had discovered the ranch's extensive library and spent the morning reading adventure stories that transported him far from the harsh realities of their recent life. Rose had attached herself to Mrs. Murphy with the devotion of a child, starved for maternal attention, helping with small tasks and chattering about everything she saw. Jake, fully recovered from his illness, had become the darling of the household staff, charming everyone with his sunny disposition and remarkable vocabulary for such a young child. That boy's got his mother's quick mind, Mrs. Murphy observed as they watched Jake demonstrate his ability to count to 10 for the third time that afternoon. And her healing touch, I'd wager. Seen it before in families with the gift. Emma felt a flush of pride at the compliment. Jake had always been precocious, but she'd been too worried about basic survival to pay much attention to his development. Seeing him thrive in this environment of safety and abundance reminded her of all the potential that poverty had forced her to ignore. It was mid-afternoon when Daniel finally returned, stamping snow from his boots and bringing the crisp scent of winter air into the warm house. Emma heard his voice in the kitchen, consulting with Mrs. Murphy about something, and found herself smoothing her hair and checking her appearance in the mirror above the fireplace. The dress Mrs. Murphy had provided was one of several that had mysteriously appeared in the wardrobe, all in Emma's size and all obviously expensive. When she'd asked about them, the housekeeper had simply said they'd been put away for too long and deserved to see sunlight again. "How was your first morning as the valley's new healer?" Daniel asked when he found her in the parlor, where she'd been reviewing her mental notes about the various medical needs she'd encountered. "Enlightening," Emma replied, setting aside the medical journal she'd been reading from his extensive library. "You weren't exaggerating about the need for medical care out here. I've already been consulted about several conditions that need attention." Daniel settled into the chair across from her, and Emma noticed he looked tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally drained in a way that suggested the day had been about more than just ranch work. "Something troubling you?" she asked before she could stop herself. Daniel was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Had a visit from Richard Stone this morning. Seems word of your arrival has already reached town." Emma felt her stomach drop. "What kind of visit?" "The kind where a man expresses concern about my judgment while making veiled threats about my business interests." Daniel replied grimly. "Stone's had his eye on this ranch for years, looking for any excuse to question my competence or fitness to manage such extensive holdings." The implications hit Emma like a physical blow. Her presence here wasn't just affecting her own life, but potentially endangering Daniel's entire operation. "I should leave," she said quietly. "I won't be responsible for causing you trouble." "No." Daniel's voice carried such authority that Emma looked up in surprise. You're not leaving because small-minded men can't understand kindness when they see it. Besides, his expression softened. It's too late for that anyway. What do you mean? Daniel leaned forward in his chair, his gray eyes serious. I mean that watching you with your children, seeing you interact with the ranch families today, having voices around my dinner table again. Emma, I haven't felt this alive in 5 years. If Stone wants to make trouble, let him try. I've faced down bigger threats than a banker with delusions of importance. The intensity in his voice made Emma's heart race. This was about more than employment or temporary charity. This was about connection, about two people who'd found something in each other that neither had expected to discover again. Daniel, she began, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. I know this is complicated. I know you're still grieving your husband, and I'm not asking you to replace those feelings with something new. But I am asking you to consider the possibility that what we're building here could be good for all of us. Your children are thriving, you're using skills that bring you joy, and he paused, seeming to search for words. I'm remembering what it feels like to have a future worth planning for. Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the vulnerability in his admission. This strong, successful man was laying his heart bare, offering her not just security but partnership. The thought terrified her because she could feel herself wanting it more than was safe or reasonable. I care about you, Emma, Daniel continued quietly. About all of you, more than I thought I'd ever care about anyone again. And I think maybe, you might be starting to care about me too. Emma couldn't deny it. Over the past day and night, she'd found herself watching Daniel with her children, noting his patience with Ben's serious questions, his gentle teasing that made Rose giggle, his natural ease with baby Jake. More than that, she'd caught herself studying his face when he thought she wasn't looking, appreciating the laugh lines around his eyes, and the way his entire expression softened when he smiled. It's too soon, she said finally, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Is it? Daniel asked. Or is that just fear talking? I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Emma. I'm asking you to stay long enough to see what we might build together. Give us a chance to find out if this feeling is real or just two lonely people grabbing at shadows. Before Emma could respond, the sound of children's laughter drifted in from the kitchen, followed by Mrs. Murphy's voice praising some accomplishment. The normalcy of it, the sense of family and belonging, made Emma's chest tight with longing. There's something else, Daniel said, his voice carrying an odd note that made Emma look at him more closely. Something I need to tell you about my first marriage. About why Sarah Beth's pregnancy has everyone so nervous. Emma waited, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal was important. My wife Catherine died in childbirth, Daniel said quietly. But not the way most people think. She lived through the delivery just fine. It was afterwards, when complications set in, that we lost her. The baby, our son, he lived for 3 days before his lungs gave out. Emma's heart clenched with sympathy. She'd seen similar tragedies in her work as a midwife, knew how helpless men felt when faced with the mysteries and dangers of childbirth. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done. Daniel continued. But I've always wondered if having someone with real experience, someone who understood women's bodies and the healing arts. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Understanding dawned on Emma. This wasn't just about providing medical care to the valley's scattered population. This was about Daniel's desperate hope that her presence might prevent other families from suffering the loss that had devastated his life. Daniel, she said gently, you can't save Catherine by saving other women. That's not how healing works. I know that, he replied. But maybe I can honor her memory by making sure other children don't grow up without mothers. Other men don't lose the women they love because help was too far away. The nobility of his motivation, the way he transformed his grief into purpose, made Emma fall a little bit more in love with him. The realization shocked her with its intensity and clarity. She was falling in love with Daniel Whitmore,
This complicated man who'd rescued her family and was now asking her to help him heal his own wounds. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "Not just until spring, but for as long as you'll have us. You're right about the medical needs here, and I think maybe we both deserve a chance to find out what this feeling between us might become." Daniel's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, leaning back in his chair with an expression that was part serious, part amused. "About Sarah Beth Morrison and her dreams of something special about her baby." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What about them?" "I've got a feeling," Daniel said slowly, "that by summer, there's going to be more new life in this valley than anyone expects. And I have a strange suspicion that you're going to be right in the middle of it all." The cryptic statement puzzled Emma, but before she could ask for clarification, Rose burst into the parlor, with Jake toddling behind her. Both children sticky with what appeared to be cookie dough and radiating the kind of joy that only comes from being completely, utterly safe. "Mama!" Rose exclaimed, throwing herself into Emma's arms. "Mrs. Murphy taught me how to make snickerdoodles, and Jake helped, and Mr. Daniel, did you know that Mrs. Murphy has a cat that catches mice but never hurts them? She just carries them outside and lets them go." As Emma listened to her daughter's excited chatter, she felt the last of her resistance melt away. This was what her children deserved: safety, abundance, and the freedom to be children again. Whatever complications might arise from her growing feelings for Daniel, whatever challenges they might face from people like Richard Stone, it would all be worth it to see her children flourish. That evening, as snow continued to fall outside the warm windows of the Whitmore ranch house, Emma tucked her children into their beds and allowed herself to dream of a future she'd never dared imagine. A future where she belonged somewhere, where her skills were valued, where love might bloom again in the most unexpected of places. Down the hall, Daniel sat at his desk writing letters to business associates and preparing for the challenges he knew would come. Richard Stone wouldn't give up easily, and there would be other obstacles to overcome before Emma and her children could truly call this place home. But for the first time since Catherine's death, Daniel felt like he was fighting for something worth winning. Outside, the storm showed signs of breaking, but inside the house that was rapidly becoming a home, new bonds were forming that would prove stronger than any winter weather. The healing had begun for all of them, and with spring still months away, there would be time for those bonds to deepen into something unbreakable. Part 3, Roots taking hold. February melted into March with a gentleness that surprised everyone in Cedar Falls. The brutal winter storms gave way to crisp, clear days that hinted at the spring waiting just beyond the mountain peaks. For Emma, these weeks passed in a blur of activity that left her feeling more useful and fulfilled than she had since William's death. Her reputation as a healer spread quickly through the scattered communities of the valley, and hardly a day passed without someone seeking her help. The cottage Daniel had promised materialized into reality with surprising speed. Located a comfortable walking distance from the main house, it was larger and better appointed than any home Emma had ever imagined calling her own. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a proper stove, a sitting room with a fireplace, and best of all, a dedicated space for her medical supplies and herb preparations. Mrs. Murphy had overseen the furnishing with the enthusiasm of a woman finally having someone to fuss over, and the result was a home that felt both comfortable and professional. Ben had thrown himself into his studies with the intensity of a boy making up for lost time. Daniel had engaged a tutor from Denver, a young man named James Wright, who came highly recommended and had experience teaching children from frontier families. The transformation in Ben was remarkable. His serious demeanor remained, but it was now tempered with the excitement of discovery as he explored subjects that had been impossible during their months of wandering. "Did you know," Ben announced one morning over breakfast at the main house, "that some people think there might be oil under the ground in Colorado?" Mr. Wright says it could be even more valuable than silver someday. Daniel nodded seriously, treating the 8-year-old's observation with the respect due a fellow businessman. Oil's been found in Pennsylvania and other eastern states. Wouldn't surprise me if we've got some here too. What do you think we should do if we find oil on ranch land? Emma watched the conversation with growing amazement. Daniel wasn't just tolerating her children's presence, he was actively nurturing their development, encouraging their curiosity and treating them as valued members of the household. The sight of her son sitting straighter, speaking with confidence, and clearly thriving under Daniel's attention made her heart swell with gratitude and something deeper. Rose had discovered a talent for music under Mrs. Murphy's patient instruction. The housekeeper had produced an old piano from somewhere in the house's depths, and Rose's natural ear for melody had quickly become apparent. Her practice sessions filled the house with cheerful sounds that seemed to breathe new life into rooms that had been silent too long. Jake, meanwhile, had appointed himself the ranch's unofficial mascot. At 18 months, he was walking confidently and charming everyone he encountered with his sunny disposition and rapidly expanding vocabulary. He followed Daniel around whenever possible, chattering in his mixture of real words and toddler language that Daniel seemed to understand perfectly. Horses, Jake would announce importantly, pointing toward the pastures. Big horses. That's right, little man. Daniel would reply with complete seriousness. Those are very big horses. Someday you'll learn to ride them. The easy affection between Daniel and her youngest child sometimes took Emma's breath away. Jake had been barely walking when William died, with no real memory of his father. To him, Daniel wasn't a replacement or a substitute, he was simply the man who belonged in their family, as natural and necessary as breathing. Emma's medical practice had grown beyond anything she'd anticipated. Word of her skills had spread not just through the immediate valley, but to homesteads and settlements scattered throughout the mountainous region. She'd successfully treated everything from difficult births, to broken bones, to the persistent lung ailments that plagued miners and their families. More importantly, she'd begun training several of the local women in basic medical care, creating a network of healers who could provide support when she couldn't be everywhere at once. Sarah Beth Morrison had become a particular focus of Emma's attention. The young woman was progressing well through her pregnancy, but Emma had noticed signs that suggested this birth might be more complicated than average. Nothing alarming, but enough to warrant careful monitoring and preparation for potential difficulties. "How are you feeling today?" Emma asked during one of her regular visits to the Morrison cottage. "Good," Sarah Beth replied, though Emma noticed she was favoring her left side slightly. "Though I've been having the strangest sensations, like there's more movement than there should be for one baby." Emma's trained hands moved carefully over Sarah Beth's rounded belly, feeling for the telltale signs she'd learned to recognize over years of attending births. What she found made her pause and re-examine more carefully. The size was larger than expected for a single baby at this stage, and the pattern of movement suggested something that made her heart race with possibility. "Sarah Beth," Emma said carefully, "I think we need to consider the possibility that you might be carrying twins." The young woman's eyes widened in shock. "Twins? But how can you tell? The size, the positioning, the way the baby moves," Emma explained. "I can't be completely certain without more time to observe, but all the signs point in that direction. How do you feel about that possibility?" Sarah Beth was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on her belly as if trying to communicate with the children growing inside her. "Overwhelming," she said finally, "but also, right, somehow. Like it explains the dreams I've been having." Emma made careful notes in her record book, already planning the additional preparations that would be needed for a twin birth. More supplies, more hands to help, and careful monitoring to ensure both babies had the best possible chance of survival. The thought of delivering twins in a frontier setting was both exciting and terrifying, but Emma felt confident in her abilities and grateful to be practicing in a place where she had support and resources. It was during one of these medical visits that Emma encountered her first real opposition to her presence in the valley. Marcus Flynn, whose ranch bordered Daniel's property to the east, had requested her services for his wife, who was struggling with a respiratory ailment that had persisted through the winter. Emma had agreed readily, gathering her supplies and riding out to the Flynn homestead with high hopes of being able to help. The Flynn ranch was smaller than Daniel's operation, but well maintained and obviously prosperous. Marcus Flynn himself was a man in his 40s, stocky and weathered, with the kind of suspicious eyes that seemed to catalog everything and trust nothing. His wife, Margaret, was a thin, nervous woman who clearly needed medical attention but seemed almost afraid to accept it. "So you're the woman everyone's talking about," Marcus said without preamble as Emma dismounted from her horse. Daniel Whitmore's new pet project. Emma felt her spine stiffen at the deliberate insult, but kept her voice level. "I'm Emma Carter, and I'm here to help your wife if I can. Mrs. Murphy said she's been having trouble breathing." "Margaret's fine," Marcus said curtly. "Just a winter cough that'll clear up when the weather warms. Don't need some charlatan woman poking around with her herbs and nonsense." The word charlatan hit Emma like a slap. She'd heard similar accusations before, knew that some people viewed midwifery and herbal medicine as somehow less legitimate than the formal training male doctors received. But after weeks of successful treatments and grateful patients, she'd forgotten how much those words could sting. "Mr. Flynn," Emma said carefully, "I'm a trained midwife with experience treating respiratory ailments. If your wife is ill, I might be able to help her recover more quickly and comfortably." "What my wife needs," Marcus replied, his voice carrying an edge of hostility, "is for certain people to stop disrupting the natural order of things. We've gotten along fine in this valley, without outsiders coming in and stirring up trouble." Emma realized this wasn't really about medical care at all. This was about her relationship with Daniel, about the threat her presence represented to whatever plans Marcus Flynn might have had regarding the most powerful rancher in the area. The realization made her angry rather than intimidated. "Mr. Flynn," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd developed through years of dealing with difficult situations. "I don't know what you think my presence here represents, but I can assure you it has nothing to do with stirring up trouble. I'm here to provide medical care to people who need it. If you don't want my help, that's your choice, but don't pretend it's because you're protecting your wife from some kind of fraud." Marcus's face darkened at her direct challenge to his authority. "You've got some nerve talking to me like that on my own property. But then I suppose that's what comes of letting a woman get above herself, forgetting her proper place." The conversation was clearly going nowhere productive, and Emma was beginning to worry about her safety. Marcus Flynn was the kind of man who didn't take well to being challenged, especially by a woman. She was preparing to mount her horse and leave, when a weak voice called from the farmhouse porch. "Marcus, please," Margaret Flynn said, her voice barely audible over the distance. "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Carter." The rebellion was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret Flynn, despite her obvious fear of her husband's reaction, was asserting her right to make decisions about her own medical care. Emma felt a surge of respect for the woman's courage. Marcus looked furious at his wife's interference, but something in her tone or expression must have warned him against creating a public scene. "5 minutes," he said curtly. "Then I want you off my property." Emma's examination of Margaret Flynn revealed a respiratory infection that was indeed serious and getting worse. Left untreated, it could develop into pneumonia or other complications that might prove fatal. More troubling was the evidence of old injuries that suggested Margaret's problems went beyond simple illness. "How long have you had these symptoms?" Emma asked gently, noting the way Margaret flinched at sudden movements and kept her voice low as if afraid of being overheard. "Since before Christmas," Margaret admitted. "Started as just a cold, but it never went away. Gets worse when the weather's damp." Emma mixed a preparation of herbs that would help clear Margaret's lungs and reduce the inflammation, but she suspected the real problem was the stress and fear that seemed to permeate the Flynn household. Chronic anxiety could weaken the body's ability to fight off infection, and Margaret Flynn was clearly a woman living under constant strain. "Mrs. Flynn," Emma said quietly, "if you ever need help with anything beyond medical care, please know that you can send word to me through Mrs. Murphy or any of the ranch hands. Sometimes a woman needs support that goes beyond herbs and tonics." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the medicine and for understanding." Emma left the Flynn ranch, feeling troubled and angry. She'd encountered men like Marcus Flynn before, men who used their physical strength and social position to control and intimidate the woman in their lives. The thought of Margaret Flynn trapped in that house, with a man who clearly didn't respect her autonomy or well-being, made Emma's heart ache with sympathy. The encounter also served as a reminder that her presence in the valley wasn't universally welcomed. Marcus Flynn represented a faction of the community that viewed her relationship with Daniel as somehow threatening to their own interests. Emma suspected there would be more confrontations ahead, more challenges to her right to practice medicine and live independently. When she returned to the Whitmore ranch, she found Daniel waiting for her with an expression of concern that suggested he'd heard about her encounter with Marcus Flynn. News traveled fast in the scattered communities of the valley, and Emma wasn't surprised that word of the confrontation had already reached him. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked immediately, helping her down from her horse and studying her face for signs of distress. "I'm fine," Emma replied, though she appreciated his concern. "Marcus Flynn made it clear that I'm not welcome on his property, but I was able to help his wife before he threw me out." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Marcus has always been a difficult man, but he had no right to treat you disrespectfully. If he threatened you in any way—" "He didn't threaten me," Emma said quickly, not wanting to escalate the situation. "He just made his position on my presence here very clear. I suspect he's not the only one who feels that way." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Emma, there's something we need to discuss. Something I probably should have told you weeks ago." Emma felt her
Stomach drop. "What is it?" "The reason Marcus and some of the other ranchers are hostile to your presence here isn't just about medical care or social propriety," Daniel said carefully. "It's about land and water rights and the balance of power in this valley." Emma waited for him to continue, though she was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. "I control more land and water than anyone else in the region," Daniel explained. "That gives me influence over grazing rights, mining claims, and development opportunities. Some people have been waiting for me to make a mistake, to show poor judgment that might give them leverage to challenge my holdings." "And taking in a homeless widow and her children counts as poor judgment?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. "To men like Marcus Flynn and Richard Stone, yes," Daniel replied. "They see your presence here as evidence that I'm making decisions based on emotion rather than business sense. They're hoping to use our relationship to question my competence and potentially challenge my land claims." Emma felt the familiar weight of being a burden, of causing problems for someone who'd shown her nothing but kindness. "I should leave," she said quietly. "I won't be responsible for endangering everything you've built." "No," Daniel said firmly, his hands gentle but insistent on her shoulders. "You're not leaving, and you're not responsible for other people's greed and prejudice. I knew there might be challenges when I asked you to stay, and I'm prepared to face them. But if they can use our relationship against you, then let them try," Daniel interrupted. "Emma, what we're building here is worth fighting for. Your medical practice is saving lives. Your children are thriving. And he paused, seeming to search for the right words. I'm happier than I've been since Catherine died. I won't let small-minded men destroy that because they can't understand that some things matter more than land and money. Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the intensity in his voice. This man was willing to risk everything he'd built for her and her children, not because he pitied them, but because he'd found something in their relationship that he considered worth any price. There's something else, Daniel said, his expression growing more serious. Something I've been thinking about since our conversation about Sarah Beth and her pregnancy. Emma waited, curious about the shift in his tone. I've been watching you work these past weeks, Daniel continued. Seeing how naturally you connect with patients, how much you care about their well-being, how skilled you are at managing difficult situations. And I've been thinking about what it would mean to have someone with your abilities as a permanent part of this valley's community. Emma wasn't sure where this was leading, but something in Daniel's manner suggested it was important. What I'm trying to say, Daniel said slowly, is that I think you're going to be instrumental in bringing new life to this valley in ways that go beyond just medical care. I have a feeling that by summer there are going to be changes here that none of us can fully anticipate yet. The cryptic statement puzzled Emma, but before she could ask for clarification, the sound of children's voices interrupted their conversation. Ben, Rose, and Jake came running from the direction of the barn, their faces bright with excitement about some discovery they'd made among the farm animals. As Emma watched her children approach, she realized that Daniel was right about one thing. There were definitely changes coming to the valley, and she was going to be right in the middle of them all. The question was whether those changes would bring the happiness and security they all hoped for, or whether the opposition they were facing would prove too strong to overcome. That evening, as March winds rattled the windows of her cottage and she tucked her children into beds that were truly their own for the first time in months, Emma allowed herself to dream of a future where her growing feelings for Daniel could bloom into something lasting and true. A future where her medical practice could flourish without opposition, where her children could grow up safe and loved, and where the mysterious changes Daniel had hinted at would bring joy rather than sorrow to all their lives. Part 4. The storm-gathering April arrived in the Colorado mountains, with the dramatic flair that characterized everything about the region. One day brought snow flurries and bitter winds, the next dawned warm and clear with wild flowers, beginning to peek through the last patches of winter snow. For Emma, the changing season brought both hope and apprehension as she watched the various forces gathering that would ultimately determine her family's fate in Cedar Falls. Sarah Beth Morrison's pregnancy had progressed exactly as Emma had predicted, with all signs continuing to point toward twins. The young woman was handling the discovery with remarkable grace, though Emma could see the worry in her husband Tom's eyes whenever he looked at his wife's expanding figure. Twin births were always more complicated, and everyone in the valley seemed to understand that this delivery would be a test of Emma's skills as a midwife. "How are you feeling today?" Emma asked during one of her regular examinations, her experienced hands carefully mapping the positions of the babies growing inside Sarah Beth's womb. "Like I'm carrying two busy children who can't agree on which direction they want to face." Sarah Beth replied with a laugh that didn't quite hide her nervousness. "They seem to take turns kicking me, as if they're already competing for attention." Emma smiled at the description, but her trained touch had detected something that made her more concerned than she wanted to admit. The babies were indeed in different positions, with one presenting head down as expected and the other stubbornly remaining breech. The situation wasn't immediately dangerous, but it would require careful management during labor to ensure both children could be delivered safely. The breech position meant that the second twin would require more careful handling, and Emma was already making mental preparations for the various scenarios she might face. "I want to talk to you about the delivery," Emma said gently, settling into the chair beside Sarah Beth's bed. "Based on what I'm feeling, I believe you're definitely carrying twins, and they're positioned in a way that will require some extra care during labor." Sarah Beth's hand moved instinctively to her belly. "What kind of extra care?" "One baby is head down, which is perfect," Emma explained. "But the second is breech, which means the feet will come first. It's not dangerous if handled properly, but it does mean we'll need to be prepared for a longer labor and potentially more assistance during the delivery." Tom Morrison, who had been quietly listening from his position by the window, stepped forward with obvious concern. What kind of assistance? Should we try to get Dr. Hayes out here? Emma considered the question carefully. Dr. Hayes was a competent physician, but his experience with difficult births was limited, and she suspected his presence might actually complicate matters rather than help them. I've delivered breech babies before, including twins, she said confidently. What I'd prefer is to have Miss Murphy assist me, along with one or two other women who can help if needed. Sometimes too many hands make a difficult situation worse. The conversation continued for another hour as Emma explained her birth plan and addressed the couple's concerns. By the time she left the Morrison cottage, she felt confident that both parents understood what to expect and were prepared for the challenges ahead. More importantly, she felt certain that with proper preparation and care, both babies would arrive safely. The ride back to the main ranch gave Emma time to think about the broader implications of Sarah Beth's pregnancy. Word had already spread throughout the valley that the new midwife would be delivering twins, and Emma was aware that her success or failure in this case would largely determine how the community viewed her medical skills. A successful delivery would cement her reputation and silence most of her critics. A poor outcome, however, could destroy everything she'd built and potentially endanger Daniel's position as well. She found Daniel in his study, poring over ledgers and correspondence with the focused intensity that characterized all his business dealings. He looked up when she entered, and Emma was struck again by how naturally he smiled when he saw her, as if her presence automatically brightened whatever concerns might be weighing on his mind. "How's Sarah Beth?" he asked, setting aside his papers to give her his full attention. "Progressing well, though the delivery will be challenging," Emma replied, settling into the comfortable chair across from his desk. "I'm confident we can manage it, but I wanted to discuss something with you." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. "What's troubling you?" "It's not just about the delivery itself," Emma said carefully. "It's about what it represents. Everyone in the valley is watching to see how this birth goes, and I suspect people like Marcus Flynn and Richard Stone are hoping for complications they can use against both of us." Daniel was quiet for a moment, clearly understanding the political implications of what Emma was saying. "Are you having second thoughts about taking the case?" "No," Emma replied firmly. "Sarah Beth needs my help, and I believe I can give her the best possible care. But I want you to understand that if something goes wrong, if we lose one of the babies, or if Sarah Beth has complications, our enemies will use it as evidence that I'm not qualified to practice medicine here. And they'll use it as evidence that my judgment is impaired for supporting you." Daniel added, completing the thought Emma hadn't wanted to voice. "Yes," Emma admitted. "Are you prepared for that possibility?" Daniel stood up from his desk and moved to the window that overlooked the pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. "Emma, 5 years ago, I lost my wife and son because the doctor we trusted didn't have the skills needed to handle a complicated birth. Since then, I've watched other women in this valley suffer through difficult labors with inadequate care. And I've wondered how many babies and mothers we've lost that didn't need to die." He turned back to face her, his expression intense. "You represent the possibility that those losses don't have to continue. Yes, there's risk involved. And yes, our enemies will use any opportunity to attack us. But the alternative is to let fear dictate our choices, and I refuse to live that way anymore." Emma felt a surge of emotion at his words. This wasn't just about supporting her medical practice or even their growing relationship. This was about Daniel's determination to honor his wife's memory by ensuring other families didn't suffer the same losses his had endured. "There's something else we need to discuss," Daniel said, returning to his chair. "I've been receiving letters from various business associates and political figures who've heard about our situation here. Some are supportive, but others are expressing concern about my judgment and decision-making." Emma felt her heart sink. What kind of concern? The kind that could affect my ability to secure loans, maintain business partnerships, and protect my land holdings. Daniel replied honestly. "Richard Stone has been corresponding with banks in Denver and Cheyenne, suggesting that my recent personal decisions indicate instability that might make me a poor credit risk." The implications were staggering. Emma had known that her presence might cause social complications, but she hadn't fully grasped how it could threaten Daniel's entire business empire. "Daniel, I can't let you risk everything for me and my children." "You're not letting me do anything," Daniel said firmly.
I'm making a choice based on what I believe is right and what will make me happiest in the long run. Yes, there are risks involved, but there are risks in any worthwhile endeavor. Before Emma could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a group of riders approaching the main house, led by a man Emma didn't recognize, but who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Daniel's expression grew grim as he watched the approaching party. "Judge Harrison," he said quietly, "this isn't a social call." Emma felt a chill of apprehension. Judge Harrison was the territorial judge who had jurisdiction over land disputes and questions of legal competency. His presence could only mean that their enemies had escalated their campaign beyond gossip and business pressure to actual legal challenges. The knock on the front door came within minutes, followed by Mrs. Murphy's voice announcing the judge's arrival. Daniel straightened his shoulders and headed for the parlor to receive his unexpected guests, with Emma following close behind despite her instinct to flee. Judge Harrison was a man in his 60s, distinguished and imposing in the way that successful politicians often were. He was accompanied by two other men Emma didn't recognize, both wearing the kind of expensive clothes that suggested they were either lawyers or wealthy businessmen from outside the valley. "Daniel," Judge Harrison said with the careful neutrality of a man conducting official business, "I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit, but I've received some concerns about your recent activities that require investigation." "What kind of concerns?" Daniel asked, his voice equally neutral but carrying an undertone of steel that warned against taking liberties. "Questions about your mental competency and fitness to manage extensive property holdings," one of the accompanying men said before the judge could respond. "I'm Attorney Walsh from Denver, representing certain business interests that have investments in this region." Emma felt the words like a physical blow. This was exactly what she'd feared would happen, and the presence of outside lawyers suggested that the opposition to her relationship with Daniel had grown beyond local politics to involve powerful interests from the territorial capital. "On what grounds?" Daniel asked, his voice remaining calm despite the obvious seriousness of the situation. "Reports of erratic behavior, poor judgment in personal relationships, and decisions that appear to prioritize emotional impulses over sound business practices," Attorney Walsh replied, consulting a folder of documents he'd brought with him. "Specifically," Judge Harrison added, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with the proceedings, "allegations that you've allowed personal relationships to cloud your judgment regarding property management and financial decisions." Emma realized that this was the moment she'd been dreading since accepting Daniel's offer to stay at the ranch. Everything they'd built together, all the happiness her children had found, the medical practice that was saving lives throughout the valley, all of it was being threatened by men who saw their relationship as somehow inappropriate or dangerous. "Judge Harrison," Daniel said with the calm authority that had made him successful in business, "I assume you have specific allegations you'd like me to address rather than vague accusations about my personal life. We've received testimony that you've made substantial financial commitments to support a woman and her children whom you've known for less than 3 months." Attorney Walsh replied. "Additionally, there are reports that you've allowed this woman to practice medicine without proper licensing or oversight, potentially endangering the health of valley residents." The attack was more sophisticated than Emma had expected. By combining questions about Daniel's financial decisions with concerns about her medical practice, their enemies had created a narrative that portrayed both of them as reckless and potentially dangerous to the community. "I'd like to hear more about these concerns regarding Mrs. Carter's medical practice," Judge Harrison said, turning his attention to Emma for the first time. "Do you have formal training in medicine or midwifery?" Emma straightened her shoulders and met the judge's gaze directly. "I was trained by my mother, who was a respected midwife in Missouri for over 30 years. I've successfully delivered more than 60 babies and treated countless other medical conditions using traditional healing methods that have been proven effective over generations. But no formal medical school training or territorial licensing," Attorney Walsh pressed. "There are no medical schools that admit women, and no licensing requirements for midwives in Colorado Territory." Emma replied evenly. "My qualifications are based on experience, results, and the trust of the families I've served. Results that cannot be verified," Attorney Walsh continued, and practices that may not meet proper medical standards. Daniel stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. Are you suggesting that the territorial government would prefer that women in remote areas give birth without any skilled assistance rather than accept help from someone with Emma's experience and proven abilities? We're suggesting, Judge Harrison said carefully, that proper oversight and regulation are necessary to protect public health and safety. The conversation continued for another hour, with the judge and his companions asking detailed questions about Daniel's recent business decisions, his financial support for Emma and her children, and the medical care she'd been providing to Valley residents. Throughout it all, Emma was struck by the careful way the accusations were phrased, always stopping just short of direct allegations that could be easily refuted. Finally, Judge Harrison closed his folder and prepared to leave. Daniel, I want you to understand that these proceedings are preliminary in nature. No formal charges have been filed, and no immediate action will be taken. However, I would strongly advise you to consider whether your recent decisions are in your best long-term interests. Are you threatening me, Judge? Daniel asked quietly. I'm advising you as someone who's known you for many years and respects what you've accomplished, Judge Harrison replied. Sometimes a man can become so focused on personal happiness that he loses sight of broader responsibilities and consequences. After the official party left, Emma and Daniel sat in the parlor in stunned silence. The threat was now explicit and immediate. Their enemies weren't content to wait for natural consequences or social pressure to separate them. They were prepared to use the legal system and political influence to force the issue. I should leave tonight, Emma said quietly. Take the children and disappear before this gets any worse. No, Daniel replied firmly. Running away won't solve anything, and it will only convince people that the accusations against us are true. But if they can prove you're financially supporting us, if they can question my medical practices, then we'll defend ourselves with the truth. Daniel interrupted. Emma, what we're doing isn't wrong. You're saving lives with your medical skills. I'm providing security for a family that needs it. And we're both building something meaningful together. If that threatens certain people's interests, then maybe their interests deserve to be threatened. Emma wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love and right would triumph over greed and prejudice. But she'd seen too much of the world's cruelty to have faith in such optimistic outcomes. Powerful men with political connections and legal resources didn't usually lose to frontier widows and independent ranchers, no matter how noble their cause might be. What happens now? She asked. Now we prepare for war, Daniel replied grimly. They've shown their hand, and we know what we're facing. The question is whether we're strong enough and smart enough to defeat them. That evening, Emma sat in her cottage with her children gathered around her, trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy while her mind raced with fear and uncertainty. Ben was reading aloud from one of his school books, Rose was practicing a simple melody on her small violin, and Jake was playing contentedly with the wooden toys Daniel had carved for him. The picture of domestic tranquility seemed almost mocking given the threats that surrounded them. Mama, Ben said suddenly, looking up from his book. Is something wrong? You seem worried about something. Emma realized she hadn't been hiding her anxiety as well as she'd hoped. Her oldest child had always been perceptive, and the months of hardship they'd endured together had taught him to read her moods with uncomfortable accuracy. There are some people who don't think we should be living here, Emma said carefully, not wanting to frighten her children, but knowing they deserved some explanation for the tension they'd undoubtedly sensed. Because we don't have money like Mr. Daniel? Rose asked, her young voice carrying a wisdom that broke Emma's heart. Something like that, Emma replied. Some people think that families like ours don't belong in places like this. But Mr. Daniel wants us here, Ben said with the logical directness of childhood. And we help people with your medicines. Why would anyone want us to leave? Emma struggled to find words that would explain adult prejudice and political maneuvering to children who saw the world in simpler, more honest terms. How could she make them understand that their happiness and security were being threatened, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because their very existence challenged certain people's assumptions about how the world should work? Sometimes grown-ups disagree about things that seem simple to children, she said finally. What matters is that we stick together and remember that we belong wherever we're wanted and valued. Daniel wants and values us, Jake announced with the absolute certainty of a toddler. And Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the simple truth of his statement. That night, after her children were asleep, Emma stood at her cottage window, looking up at the main house, where lights still burned in Daniel's study. She knew he was probably working late into the night, preparing strategies and defenses for the battles ahead. The sight of those lights, steady and unwavering in the darkness, gave her a measure of comfort. Whatever happened, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. In the morning she would continue her medical rounds, checking on Sarah Beth Morrison and the other families who depended on her care. She would tend to their needs with the same skill and dedication she'd always shown, regardless of who might be watching or judging her actions. And she would trust that Daniel's faith in their ability to overcome the challenges ahead wasn't misplaced. The storm gathering around them was real and dangerous, but Emma had weathered storms before. This time, however, she had allies and resources she'd never possessed during her months of wandering. More importantly, she had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. She had a home, a purpose, and the beginning of a love that felt strong enough to withstand whatever forces might be arrayed against it. As spring advanced toward summer in the Colorado mountains, Emma Carter prepared to defend not just her right to practice medicine or her children's security, but the very possibility that two people from different worlds could create something beautiful and lasting together. The battle ahead would test everything she believed about justice, love, and the power of truth to triumph over prejudice. But for the first time since William's death, Emma felt ready to fight for a future worth claiming. Part 4. The challenge unveiled. May brought unseasonable warmth to the Colorado mountains, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and filling the valley with the green promise of summer. For Emma, the advancing season carried both hope and dread, as Sarah Beth Morrison's delivery date approached, and the legal pressures surrounding her relationship with Daniel continued to intensify. The combination of professional challenge and personal threat created a tension that colored every aspect of her daily life. The morning that would change everything began like any other, with Emma making her rounds to check on various patients throughout the valley. Her first stop was the Morrison cottage, where she found Sarah Beth uncomfortable but progressing normally toward what Emma calculated would be a birth within the next week or two. The twin pregnancy had developed exactly as Emma had predicted, with both babies now clearly defined and the breech presentation of the second child confirmed. "I've been having dreams again," Sarah Beth confided as Emma completed her examination. "Not about the babies this time, but about you. Strange dreams where you're holding two babies that aren't mine, talking to them like they're somehow connected to your future." Emma felt a curious flutter in her chest at the description, though she dismissed it as the kind of anxious fantasy that often plagued women approaching childbirth. "Pregnant women often have vivid dreams," she said gently. "Your mind is probably just processing all the changes happening in your life." "Maybe," Sarah Beth agreed, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "But these dreams feel different, more like visions than regular dreams. Like I'm seeing something that's going to happen rather than just imagining possibilities." Emma made careful notes about Sarah Beth's condition and left detailed instructions for Tom about what signs to watch for that would indicate the onset of labor. As she prepared to leave, Sarah Beth caught her hand with surprising strength. "Mrs. Emma," she said urgently, "whatever happens with my babies, whatever comes after, I want you to know that you've given me hope when I had none. That matters more than you probably realize." The intensity of the young woman's gratitude made Emma uncomfortable, partly because she felt she was simply doing her job, and partly because she sensed there were undercurrents to Sarah Beth's words that she didn't fully understand. The strange dreams, the talk of visions, the feeling that something significant was building toward a climax, all of it contributed to Emma's growing sense that forces beyond her control were shaping her destiny. Her next stop was to check on Margaret Flynn, the rancher's wife, whose husband had forbidden Emma to return to their property. Emma had been providing medication through intermediaries, but she was concerned about Margaret's continued symptoms and wanted to examine her more thoroughly. The solution came from an unexpected source. Margaret had arranged to meet Emma at the home of a neighboring family, claiming she was visiting friends while her husband was away on business. What Emma found during her examination alarmed her more than Margaret's initial respiratory problems had. The woman bore clear signs of repeated physical abuse, with bruises in various stages of healing and a wariness that spoke of constant fear. More troubling still, Margaret was clearly pregnant, probably about 3 months along, and showing signs of stress that could endanger both her health and that of her developing child. Margaret, Emma said,
Gently, I need to ask you some difficult questions, and I need you to trust me with honest answers. The older woman's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded bravely. I know what you're going to ask, and yes, Marcus gets angry sometimes. More often lately, especially since he's been talking with Mr. Stone and some other men about ways to change things in the valley. Emma felt a chill of apprehension. What kind of changes? I don't understand most of it, Margaret admitted. But they're angry about Mr. Whitmore's influence and your presence here. They think if they can prove you're not qualified to practice medicine, they can use that to challenge his judgment about other things too. The confirmation of what Emma had suspected made her stomach clench with anxiety. She was being used as a weapon in a larger conflict, and Margaret Flynn was caught in the crossfire of her husband's political ambitions. Margaret, are you safe at home? Emma asked directly. If Marcus is becoming more violent, I manage, Margaret replied evasively. He's not usually angry with me specifically, just with the situation in general. But Mrs. Emma, I'm scared about this baby. I lost 2 others early on, and I don't think my body can take much more stress. Emma spent the next hour providing Margaret with both medical care and practical advice about protecting herself and her pregnancy. She also made arrangements for ongoing support through a network of women in the valley, who understood domestic situations that couldn't be addressed through official channels. As she prepared to leave, Margaret grabbed her hand with desperate intensity. Be careful, she whispered urgently. Marcus and the others are planning something. I don't know what exactly, but they're meeting more frequently now, and they talk about timing and opportunities. I think they're waiting for something specific to happen before they make their move. Emma left the clandestine meeting feeling more concerned than ever about the forces gathering against her and Daniel. The opposition wasn't just philosophical or business-related, it was personal and potentially dangerous. Men like Marcus Flynn didn't just disagree with their relationship. They saw it as a threat that needed to be eliminated by whatever means necessary. Her final appointment of the day took her to the main ranch house, where Daniel had requested that she examine one of the longtime ranch hands who'd been struggling with persistent back pain that was affecting his ability to work. Emma found the man, a weathered cowboy named Pete Rodriguez, sitting carefully in the kitchen while Mrs. Murphy fussed over him with the maternal concern she showed for anyone under her care. Started about a month ago, Pete explained as Emma began her examination. Just a twinge at first, but now it's bad enough that I can barely lift a rope, let alone wrestle cattle. Emma's experienced hands quickly identified the problem, a muscle strain that had been aggravated by continued heavy work and was now threatening to become a chronic condition. The treatment would require rest, specific exercises, and herbal preparations to reduce inflammation, but the prognosis was good if Pete would follow her recommendations. You need to stop doing heavy lifting for at least 2 weeks, Emma instructed firmly. I know that's difficult with ranch work, but if you don't let this heal properly now, you could end up with permanent damage. Can't afford to be laid up for 2 weeks, Pete protested. Spring work is too important, and Mr. Daniel needs every hand he can get. Mr. Daniel needs healthy hands more than he needs injured ones. Daniel's voice interrupted from the kitchen doorway. He'd apparently been listening to the conversation and had decided to settle the matter himself. Pete, you'll follow Emma's orders exactly, and I don't want to see you doing anything heavier than paperwork until she clears you for regular duty. The easy authority with which Daniel supported Emma's medical judgment, the way he automatically deferred to her expertise even when it created inconvenience for his business operations, reinforced Emma's growing awareness of how unusual their partnership really was. Most men, even well-meaning ones, would have questioned or second-guessed her recommendations. Daniel simply accepted her competence and backed her decisions without hesitation. After Pete left with his medications and instructions, Emma found herself alone in the kitchen with Daniel and Mrs. Murphy. The housekeeper was preparing dinner with her usual efficiency, but Emma noticed the older woman's frequent glances in their direction, and the way she seemed to be listening to their conversation with more than casual interest. "We need to talk," Daniel said quietly. "I've received some information today that changes our situation significantly." Emma felt her heart race with apprehension. "What kind of information?" "The kind that suggests our enemies are planning to make their move sooner than we expected." Daniel replied grimly. "My lawyer in Denver sent word that formal competency proceedings are being prepared, with specific allegations related to your medical practice and my financial support for your family." The news hit Emma like a physical blow. Formal legal proceedings meant that their opponents were confident enough in their position to risk public scrutiny of their accusations. It also meant that the outcome would be decided by territorial courts and political officials rather than local opinion. "What are the specific allegations?" Emma asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. "They're claiming that I've made irrational financial decisions based on emotional manipulation by an unqualified medical practitioner," Daniel explained. "They've also alleged that your medical practices have endangered Valley residents and that several patients have suffered complications due to your inadequate training." Emma felt sick with rage and fear. "What patients? What complication?" "I've kept detailed records of every case I've treated, and I haven't lost a single patient or had any serious complications." "I know that, and anyone who's actually worked with you knows that," Daniel replied. "But our enemies are counting on the fact that most people don't understand medical practice well enough to evaluate the evidence objectively. They're also hoping that the mere existence of formal allegations will be enough to damage our credibility regardless of their ultimate truth." Mrs. Murphy, who had been quietly listening while she worked, turned to face them with an expression of determination that surprised Emma with its intensity. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Daniel, but I think it's time we stopped letting these men set the terms of this fight." Both Emma and Daniel looked at the housekeeper with curiosity. Mrs. Murphy had always been supportive of their relationship, but she'd never inserted herself into discussions of strategy or politics. "What do you mean, Mrs. Murphy?" Daniel asked. "I mean that instead of waiting for them to attack you, maybe it's time to show the whole valley exactly what Mrs. Emma's medical skills are worth." The older woman replied firmly. "Sarah Beth Morrison's babies are going to be born any day now, and if Mrs. Emma can successfully deliver twins under difficult circumstances, it'll prove her competence better than any number of official documents or formal testimonials." Emma felt a chill of understanding. "You're suggesting we turn Sarah Beth's delivery into a public demonstration of my abilities." "I'm suggesting we invite the right people to witness what you can do," Mrs. Murphy corrected. "Dr. Hayes from town, some of the other ranchers' wives who understand childbirth, maybe even Judge Harrison himself if he's still in the area. Let them see firsthand whether you're a charlatan or a skilled healer." The idea was both brilliant and terrifying. A successful delivery witnessed by respected community members would indeed provide powerful evidence of Emma's competence. But if anything went wrong, if complications arose during such a public demonstration, the failure would be even more damaging than a private disaster. "It's risky," Daniel said slowly, clearly thinking through the implications. "If something goes wrong with the delivery, then we face the consequences honestly." Emma interrupted, surprising herself with her own decisiveness. "But Mrs. Murphy is right about one thing. Sitting passively while our enemies attack us isn't working. Maybe it's time to take control of the narrative ourselves." Daniel studied her face carefully. "Are you certain you want to do this? The pressure of performing under such scrutiny with so much depending on the outcome." "I've been delivering babies for over 10 years," Emma replied with growing confidence. "I know my abilities, and I trust my training. If we're going to fight for our right to be together, let's fight with our strengths rather than trying to defend against manufactured weaknesses." The conversation continued late into the evening as they planned how to arrange the public demonstration without making it seem like a staged performance. Dr. Hayes would need to be invited in a way that didn't suggest they were challenging his authority. Other witnesses would have to be selected carefully to ensure they were both credible and potentially sympathetic. Most importantly, Sarah Beth and Tom Morrison would need to understand and consent to having their private family moment turned into a public test of Emma's abilities. As Emma walked back to her cottage that night, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror about what they'd decided. In a few days, possibly a week, she would be delivering Sarah Beth Morrison's twins under the watchful eyes of people who would use the outcome to judge not just her medical competence but her right to practice healing arts in the valley. Success would vindicate everything she'd worked for and secure her family's future. Failure could destroy not only her own dreams but Daniel's life work as well. The stakes couldn't be higher, but for the first time since Judge Harrison's threatening visit, Emma felt like she was taking positive action rather than simply reacting to other people's attacks. Win or lose, she would face the future as a woman fighting for what she believed in, rather than a victim hoping for mercy from those who wished her harm. As she tucked her children into their beds and listened to their peaceful breathing in the darkness, Emma allowed herself to dream of victory. A successful delivery that would silence her critics, vindicate Daniel's faith in her abilities, and secure the home her children had come to love. It was a beautiful dream, and she clung to it fiercely as she drifted off to sleep, gathering strength for the battle that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and perhaps the beginning of the public test that would determine their fate. But tonight, surrounded by the security Daniel had provided and the love her children represented, Emma Carter felt ready to prove that something, love, family, and the right to pursue happiness on one's own terms, were worth any risk necessary to protect them. Part 5. The prophecy fulfilled. The call came at dawn on a Thursday morning in late May, carried by young Billy Morrison on horseback, his voice cracking with excitement and anxiety as he shouted from the yard that his mother's time had come. Emma was already dressed and preparing her medical supplies when the boy arrived, having spent a restless night with the strange premonition that Sarah Beth's labor was imminent. The feeling had been so strong that she'd laid out all her instruments and preparations the evening before, as if some intuitive part of her mind had known this day would be the one. "How long has your mother been laboring?" Emma asked as she secured her medical bag and prepared to mount her horse. "Since some time in the night," Billy replied, his young face tight with worry. "Pa says the pains are coming regular now, and she's asking for you special." Emma felt the familiar combination of excitement and apprehension that accompanied every birth. But this time the emotions were magnified by the knowledge that today's events would be witnessed and judged by people whose opinions could determine her family's future. Daniel had successfully arranged for Dr. Hayes to be present, ostensibly to assist if complications arose, but really to serve as an authoritative witness to Emma's competence. Several other women from prominent Valley families had also been invited to attend, creating an audience that would spread word of the outcome throughout the entire region. The Morrison cottage buzzed with quiet activity when Emma arrived. Tom Morrison met her at the door with relief evident in every line of his weathered face, while Mrs. Murphy bustled about boiling water and arranging linens with the efficiency of someone who'd assisted at countless births. Hayes was already present, sitting quietly in the front room and maintaining the diplomatic neutrality he'd promised when Daniel had approached him about observing the proceedings. "Thank goodness you're here," Tom said as he led Emma into the bedroom where Sarah Beth labored. "She's been asking for you every few minutes, and the pains seem to be getting stronger." Emma's examination confirmed that Sarah Beth was indeed well into active labor, with the first twin positioned properly for delivery and signs suggesting that the birth would proceed normally, despite the challenges presented by the breech position of the second baby. More importantly, Sarah Beth seemed strong and determined, her natural resilience clearly adequate to handle the physical demands of a twin delivery. "How are you feeling?" Emma asked, settling beside the laboring woman and taking her hand in a gesture that was both medical assessment and emotional support. "Like I'm about to meet the two little souls I've been carrying," Sarah Beth replied with a smile that demonstrated remarkable composure given her circumstances. "I've been dreaming about them again, and I have the strangest feeling that today is going to be more important than just welcoming my babies into the world." Emma felt that peculiar flutter of intuition again, the sense that forces beyond her understanding were shaping the day's events. "What kind of feeling?" "Like everything that happens today is going to change the future for more people than just our family," Sarah Beth said, her voice growing distant as another contraction built. "I keep seeing images of you holding babies that belong to you, Emma, and words about summer and twins that don't quite make sense yet." Before Emma could ask for clarification,
Sarah Beth was caught up in the intensity of a strong contraction that signaled the rapid progression of her labor. Emma immediately shifted into her professional mode, monitoring the baby's position and preparing for the active phase of delivery that she knew was approaching. The next several hours passed in the focused intensity that characterized all births, with Emma managing each stage of labor, while the assembled witnesses observed from the periphery. Dr. Hayes proved to be a respectful colleague, offering assistance when requested but never questioning Emma's decisions or attempting to take control of the situation. The other women present watched with the fascination of mothers who understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing, particularly since twin births were rare enough to be noteworthy events in frontier communities. The first baby, a robust boy with healthy lungs and perfect coloring, arrived without complications around midday. Emma quickly cleared his airways and established his breathing before turning her attention to the second twin, whose breech position required more careful management. The assembled witnesses watched with held breath as Emma worked with calm precision to guide the second baby into position for safe delivery. "The second one's fighting me," Sarah Beth gasped between contractions. "It's like this baby has a mind of its own and doesn't want to leave." Emma's experienced hands guided the breech delivery with movements that looked effortless but required years of training and practice to execute safely. The second baby, a girl as perfect and healthy as her brother, arrived feet first with an indignant cry that announced her displeasure at being disturbed from her comfortable position. "Two beautiful, healthy babies," Emma announced to the room, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done and the relief that always accompanied successful deliveries. "A boy and a girl, both breathing well and showing good color." The witnesses burst into spontaneous applause, their enthusiasm reflecting both admiration for Emma's skill and joy at witnessing the safe arrival of the Morrison twins. Dr. Hayes approached to examine the babies and offer his professional assessment, and Emma held her breath as the older physician conducted his evaluation. "Excellent work, Mrs. Carter," Dr. Hayes said finally, his words carrying the weight of official approval. "Both children are perfect, and the management of the breech delivery was textbook perfect. I couldn't have handled it any better myself." Emma felt a surge of vindication at the praise from a fellow medical professional, but her attention was immediately claimed by Sarah Beth, who was calling her name with unusual urgency. The new mother's face was flushed with excitement that seemed to go beyond the normal euphoria of successful childbirth. "Emma," Sarah Beth said, her voice carrying an odd note of prophecy, "I need to tell you what I saw during the delivery. When you were holding my babies, just for a moment, I saw you holding different babies, twins of your own. And I heard a voice saying, 'By summer you'll be carrying twins,' as clear as if someone was standing right beside me." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.